The Countess Elizabeth Bathory. In the year 1610, the Palatine of Hungary, the kingdom's highest officer, rode to Kastét's castle to arrest one of the most powerful people in the realm. Countess Elizabeth Bathory was a widow of enormous wealth, mistress of castles and estates, related to princes and kings, and the crown itself owed her family staggering sums of money. She was also, according to an investigation that gathered testimony from around 300 witnesses, responsible for the torture and death of servant girls in her castles over many years. Girls recruited from peasant villages who entered her service and did not leave it. For years, complaints from village priests and grieving families had gone exactly where complaints against the powerful always went in 1600, into silence, because the accuser was a peasant and the accused owned the ground the village stood on. Only when the deaths reached upward, into the daughters of minor nobility sent to her court for education, did the arithmetic change, and the complaints finally became impossible to ignore. The Palatine came with soldiers, and by some accounts he came carefully, timing the arrest to protect the great family's interests before the king's own courts could seize the matter, and the estates, for the crown. What happened next is the whole reason she opens this video. Her servants, the commoners who carried out and assisted the crimes, were tried within days, convicted, and executed with the full theatrical brutality of the age. The Countess herself was never tried at all. A trial would have meant scandal for great families, confiscated estates, and awkward questions about the crown's debts, so a quieter solution was engineered. Elizabeth Bathory was walled into a set of rooms in her own castle, fed through a slot, and kept there until she died 4 years later. A prisoner of stone, but never a defendant. One honest caution, because this channel deals in facts. The famous number attached to her, 650 victims, comes from second-hand talk of a ledger no court ever produced, and some modern historians argue the whole case was inflated, even engineered, precisely because her wealth made her worth destroying. Both readings end in the same place. Whether she was history's most prolific noble murderer or a rich widow devoured by richer men, the verdict was decided by money and rank, not evidence, because in her world, people like her did not stand trial. Keep that sentence in mind. It is about to sound very modern. The heir, Robert Durst. Robert Durst was born into one of the great real estate fortunes of New York City, and for nearly 40 years, people close to him kept meeting terrible ends. In 1982, his wife Kathleen, a medical student weeks from graduating and, friends said, preparing to leave the marriage, vanished and was never found. The initial investigation took Robert's account largely at face value. Key witnesses went loosely questioned, and the case faded against the Durst family's wall of lawyers, publicists, and influence, while Kathleen's family spent the next 4 decades refusing to let her name disappear with her. In 2000, New York investigators quietly reopened Kathleen's case and prepared to speak with Susan Berman, Durst's closest confidant and unofficial spokeswoman in 1982, the person who, prosecutors later argued, had helped cover his tracks and might finally say so. Before anyone could interview her, Berman was shot dead in her Los Angeles home, and an anonymous note, in handwriting that would take 20 years to come home to its author, directed police to the body. And in 2001, in Galveston, Texas, where Durst had been living cheaply disguised as a mute woman, his elderly neighbor Morris Black was killed and dismembered. And Durst, caught after jumping bond, admitted the dismemberment and claimed the death was an accident in a struggle. Then came the demonstration of what a fortune buys in an American courtroom. Durst hired one of the most formidable defense teams money could assemble, paid a bond of hundreds of thousands of dollars the way other defendants produce bus fare, and in 2003, a Texas jury, walked expertly through self-defense and reasonable doubt, acquitted him of murder, a man who had admitted dismembering his neighbor, walking out the front door of the courthouse. Jurors said afterward they had followed the law as argued. That is precisely the point. The arguing had cost more than most defendants will earn in a lifetime. For over a decade more he lived free, wealthy, and untouchable, until vanity did what prosecutors could not. Durst agreed to sit for a documentary series about his own life, The Jinx, and in its final episode, wearing a live microphone into a bathroom, he muttered to himself the words the world now knows. Killed them all, of course. He was arrested the day before the finale aired, and in 2021, a Los Angeles jury heard the whole 40-year architecture at last, and convicted him of murdering Susan Berman to keep her silent about Kathleen. New York finally indicted him for Kathleen herself. And then, before that last reckoning could reach a courtroom, he died in custody in early 2022, at 88. The full bill for 4 decades arrived, and there was no one left to pay it. The student Paris let go. Issei Sagawa. In June 1981, a Japanese graduate student at the Sorbonne named Issei Sagawa murdered a Dutch classmate, a gifted young woman named Renée Hartevelt, who had come to his apartment to help him with his studies. What he did afterward made the case notorious across the world, and this channel will not describe it, out of respect for a victim whose name deserves to outlive the horror attached to it. Sagawa was caught within days, arrested by Paris police with physical evidence that removed every question, and there was never the slightest doubt of his guilt. He confessed fully and coldly, and the case became one of the most infamous in modern French memory. And Issei Sagawa never spent a single day in prison for it, not one. A French court declared him legally insane and unfit for trial, and after 2 years in psychiatric custody, France simply deported him to Japan, where examining doctors reached the opposite conclusion, that he was sane and therefore should be tried. But a trial needed the French court documents, and France, done with the matter, declined to release them, and inside that gap between two bureaucracies, the case evaporated. In 1986, 15 months after arriving, Sagawa checked himself out of the Japanese hospital, a free man, because with no French documents, there was no charge, and with no charge, there was no legal basis to hold him. He remained free for the rest of his long life, writing books about what he had done, giving interviews, appearing in magazines, living openly as a macabre minor celebrity in Tokyo, until his death in 2022, 4 decades of a liberty no court ever granted, produced entirely by paperwork that money and embarrassment kept sealed. His father was a wealthy and connected corporate president, and observers in both countries have long argued that money and influence smoothed every hinge of that outcome: the swift deportation, the closed files, the quiet release. Renée Hartevelt's family watched the man who killed her become a talk show curiosity. No system anywhere on earth ever called it justice, because no system anywhere on earth was ever forced to try. A countess, an heir, and a rich man's son, 4 centuries apart, and the same quiet machinery underneath all 3. Money does not usually buy a verdict outright, because that would be visible, and visible corruption gets corrected. It buys the spaces between verdicts, the investigation that loses momentum, the lawyers who make a confessed dismemberment into reasonable doubt, the extradition file that never gets sent, the trial that would simply be too inconvenient for important people to hold. This series has shown poor men convicted on nothing, a van driver hanged on a neighbor's testimony, teenagers imprisoned on coerced words, and it can now show wealthy ones untouched by everything. A confessed dismemberment, a police file, a full confession in 2 languages. Justice is supposed to be blind, and most days, in most courtrooms, ordinary cases get ordinary fairness. What these cases prove is narrower and colder. She can be blind and still know exactly whose accounts she is auditing.